Snow had been falling over Maple Hollow since late afternoon, not in a storm, not in any dramatic way, but in a steady, patient drift that softened the edges of rooftops and quieted the narrow streets. By 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve, the town looked like something preserved behind glass, porch lights glowing amber, wreaths hanging neatly on white doors, smoke lifting from chimneys in slow, deliberate ribbons. The church bell rang once every half hour, not urgently, just as a reminder that the night was moving forward. Inside the Whitmore home on Cedar Lane, warmth gathered in layers. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and pine from the tree in the living room. Margaret Whitmore moved carefully between stove and counter, smoothing the edge of a tablecloth that had been used every Christmas since Clara was a child. She believed in traditions the way some people believed in medicine: steady, reliable, necessary. Thomas Whitmore stood near the front window, adjusting the strand of white lights that framed the porch. He was a man who rarely rushed anything. Even now, with snow dusting his shoulders when he stepped back inside, he closed the door gently, as if loud sounds might disturb the evening. Clara Whitmore sat at the edge of the sofa, one leg tucked beneath her, staring at the Christmas tree. At 23, she carried a kind of quiet brightness, the sort that didn't demand attention but filled a room anyway. Her dark hair fell over one shoulder, catching the light from the tree. In her hands, she turned her wedding band once, slowly, unconsciously. Daniel Whitmore emerged from the hallway in a pressed sweater and slacks, the image of small-town respectability. He kissed Margaret on the cheek and clapped Thomas lightly on the shoulder. "Looks like we'll have a white Christmas after all," Daniel said, glancing outside. Thomas nodded. "Best kind there is." Clara smiled when Daniel looked at her, but it was a softer smile than usual, something more measured. Earlier that evening, just before dinner, the phone had rung. She had stepped into the kitchen to answer it, lowering her voice so the others couldn't hear. When she returned, she'd said it was an old friend passing through town. Nothing urgent. Nothing important. Margaret noticed the way Clara's fingers trembled slightly when she reached for her glass. Mothers often notice things no one else does. "Sweetheart," Margaret asked gently, "you're staying for midnight service, aren't you?" Clara hesitated, just for a breath. "I need to step out for a little while," she replied. "I promised I'd see someone before they head out of town. I'll be back before dessert." Thomas frowned slightly but said nothing. Daniel's expression didn't change at all. He nodded as if the plan had already been discussed. "It's Christmas Eve," Margaret said softly. "Don't stay long." Clara stood and crossed the room, pulling on her wool coat. She paused beside the tree, brushing her fingertips against one of the ornaments, a small glass angel she had made in second grade. For a moment, she looked younger than 23, almost like the girl who used to insist on placing that ornament herself every year. Daniel stepped closer. "You want me to drive you?" "No," Clara answered quickly, then softened her tone. "I won't be far." Outside, the snow had grown thicker, blanketing the street in a thin layer that muffled footsteps. Clara pulled her collar closer around her neck. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that filled your lungs and reminded you that you were alive. For a second, she closed her eyes and listened, distant laughter from another house, a car door shutting down the block, the faint hum of holiday music drifting through someone's open window. Inside the house, Margaret watched through the curtain as Clara walked to her car. "She seems distracted," Margaret murmured. "She's young," Thomas replied. "Young people carry things we don't always see." Daniel stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets. "She'll be back," he said. The words were simple. Certain. Clara slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The radio automatically resumed a carol that had been playing earlier in the week. She turned it off. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the falling snow outside. Her reflection stared back at her in the darkened windshield, composed, but distant, as though she were already somewhere else. She looked back at the house once more. The lights framed the porch just the way her father liked. Through the front window, she could see the blurred outline of the tree and her mother moving near the kitchen doorway. Everything looked steady. Permanent. Her phone lay on the passenger seat. A name glowed faintly on the screen from the recent call log. She picked it up, then set it back down without dialing. "I'll be back before dessert," she whispered to herself, as if repetition could make it certain. The tires rolled slowly over the snow-covered street. Maple Hollow, on Christmas Eve, did not look like a place where anything could go wrong. The storefronts along Main Street were trimmed with garland. The diner sign blinked softly in red and green. A few people crossed the street carrying wrapped boxes and paper bags, their faces lit by the glow of shop windows. At the corner near the old pharmacy, Clara paused at a stop sign. For a long moment, she did not move. A car passed in the opposite direction, its headlights briefly illuminating her face. There was no panic there. No visible fear. Only a stillness that felt heavier than the winter air. Back on Cedar Lane, Margaret arranged plates on the dining table. She set one extra napkin beside Clara's place, smoothing it carefully. Thomas poured himself a small glass of bourbon and sat down, listening to the clock tick on the wall. Daniel checked his watch. She said she'd be back before dessert, he reminded them gently. Margaret nodded. She always keeps her promises. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet, patient, covering the tire tracks that led away from the Whitmore house. The snow continued to fall long after Clara's headlights disappeared at the end of Cedar Lane. Inside the Whitmore home, time moved the way it always had on Christmas Eve, slow, deliberate, marked by small rituals. Margaret lit 2 ivory candles in the dining room and checked the oven once more, though everything was already done. Thomas lowered himself into his armchair, the bourbon warming his throat as he listened to the faint hum of carols drifting from the radio. Daniel stood near the window again, watching the quiet street. The tire tracks Clara had left were already softening beneath the steady snowfall. "She'll be back before dessert," he said, almost to himself. Margaret forced a smile. She always keeps her word. 8:30 came and went. The turkey was carved. The mashed potatoes began to cool. Thomas suggested they start without her, but Margaret shook her head. "We'll wait." By 9, the church bells rang again in the distance. The house felt warmer than before, almost too warm, as if the air had thickened. Daniel checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "I'm sure she just ran into someone," he said. "It's Christmas Eve. People talk." Margaret nodded, but her hands had grown still in her lap. She glanced at the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. It remained silent. At 9:15, Daniel picked up the receiver and dialed Clara's number. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. He hung up and tried again. The same result. "She probably turned it off," Thomas offered. "Battery might be low." Daniel didn't respond. By 10 o'clock, the candles had burned halfway down. The room, once glowing with anticipation, now carried a strange hollowness. Margaret stood and walked to the front window, parting the curtain slightly. The street was nearly untouched, white and quiet, as if no one had passed through in hours. "I don't like this," she whispered. Daniel grabbed his coat. "I'll drive around." She said she wouldn't be far. Thomas rose slowly. "I'll go with you." "No," Daniel replied quickly. "You stay here. In case she calls." The engine of Daniel's car broke the stillness of Cedar Lane. He drove first toward Main Street, where the diner lights still blinked red and green. A few late-night customers lingered inside, their laughter visible through fogged windows. He scanned the parking lots, the side streets, the corner near the old pharmacy where Clara had paused earlier. Nothing. He drove farther than she had promised she would go, past the grocery store, past the edge of town where the road narrowed and trees leaned close on either side. Snow blanketed everything in a deceptive calm. At 10:42 p.m., he spotted something familiar along County Road 14. Clara's car sat pulled neatly onto the shoulder, angled straight, as if parked deliberately. The headlights were off. The engine was silent. Daniel's pulse quickened, but not in panic, not yet. He pulled in behind her vehicle and stepped out into the cold. Snow crunched beneath his boots. He approached slowly, almost cautiously, as though Clara might startle if he moved too fast. The driver's door was locked. He peered through the window. The seats were empty. Her purse lay on the passenger side floor. The keys were not in the ignition. He knocked on the glass, absurdly, as though she might answer from somewhere nearby. "Clara?" His voice carried only a few feet before dissolving into the snow. He walked along the roadside, scanning the ditch, the line of trees. No footprints stretched away from the car, at least none that hadn't already been softened by the falling snow. His breath came quicker now. He returned to his own car and drove back to town, the silence inside his vehicle pressing hard against his ears. When he stepped back into the Whitmore home, Margaret stood immediately. "You found her?" Daniel removed his gloves slowly. "I found the car." The words landed heavy. Thomas straightened in his chair. "What do you mean, you found the car?" "It's on County Road 14. Parked. Locked. She's not inside." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Was there any sign of?" "No," Daniel said quickly. "Nothing like that. It's just sitting there." Thomas reached for the phone. "We're calling the police." Within 20 minutes, Sheriff Raymond Cole arrived, his coat dusted with snow. He had known Clara since she was a teenager. He removed his hat respectfully when he entered the house. "Tell me everything," he said. Daniel described the location of the car. Margaret described Clara's promise to return. Thomas described the phone call earlier in the evening. Sheriff Cole listened carefully, nodding once or twice. "She's an adult," he said gently. "Sometimes folks need space." "She wouldn't do this," Margaret replied, her voice trembling. "Not tonight. Not without telling us." Cole held her gaze. "We'll check the area. We'll make some calls. But let's not assume the worst." The patrol car's flashing lights cast faint blue shadows across the snow-covered road where Clara's car waited alone. Officers searched the immediate area with flashlights, their beams cutting through the falling snow. They found no signs of struggle. No broken glass. No disturbed earth. Just a vehicle parked carefully at the edge of a quiet winter road. By midnight, the search expanded slightly. A few volunteers joined. Dogs were brought in briefly, but the snowfall made tracking difficult. Inside the Whitmore home, the Christmas tree lights continued to glow. The extra plate remained on the table, untouched. Margaret refused to clear it away. She said she'd be back before dessert, she whispered, staring at the empty chair. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient, steady, covering footprints, smoothing tire tracks, erasing the only visible path Clara had taken away from home. Morning arrived quietly over Maple Hollow, pale and cold, as though the town itself did not yet understand what had happened. Christmas Day did not feel like Christmas. The church bells rang, but their sound carried differently, thinner somehow, as if the air had shifted overnight. Clara Whitmore did not come home. By afternoon, Sheriff Raymond Cole had widened the search beyond County Road 14. Volunteers walked the wooded stretches along the highway in careful lines. Neighbors brought thermoses of coffee. Men who had once hunted deer through those same trees now scanned the snow with heavy, deliberate steps, looking for something, anything, that might explain the empty car. They found nothing. The snowfall from the night before had done its quiet work. If there had been footprints, they were gone. If there had been hesitation or struggle, it left no visible mark. Clara's purse remained in the vehicle. Her driver's license was inside. So was a folded grocery receipt from 2 days earlier. Her wedding ring had not been left behind. It had gone with her. By New Year's Day, the search had shifted from immediate rescue to uneasy investigation. Flyers were printed with Clara's photograph, her senior portrait, the one Margaret liked best. "Missing since December 24, 1992, ran in bold across the top. Daniel taped them in shop windows along Main Street. Thomas drove to neighboring towns to leave copies at gas stations and diners. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes, writing Clara's name carefully in the return address corner as if sending letters might somehow summon her back. The phone rang often that first month. Most calls were sympathetic. Some were useless tips. A woman in Harrisburg thought she'd seen Clara at a bus station. A truck driver insisted he had given a ride to someone who matched her description. Each lead ended the same way, hope rising sharply, then falling flat. In February, the snow melted, revealing brown grass and wet earth along County Road 14. Deputies searched again, this time without the interference of winter. They found nothing more than tire ruts and scattered gravel. Spring came, and with it, an unbearable clarity. Maple Hollow returned to its routines. Lawns were mowed. Children rode bicycles through the streets. The diner sign blinked as it always had. But inside the Whitmore home, time moved differently. Margaret kept Clara's bedroom exactly as it had been. The bed remained made. The curtains stayed half-drawn. Once a week, she dusted the dresser carefully, lifting each framed photograph before setting it back in its place. She did not cry loudly. Her grief settled into something quieter, more constant, like a low ache behind the ribs that never quite went away. Thomas spoke less than he used to. He began waking earlier, sitting at the kitchen table before dawn with a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands. He read the newspaper front to back, even the sections he once ignored, as if Clara's name might appear unexpectedly in a distant headline. Daniel threw himself into motion. He organized volunteer groups. He contacted private investigators. He drove to cities within a 3-hour radius to check shelters and hospitals. When reporters from a regional station asked for an interview in the spring of 1993, he agreed. She wouldn't leave without telling someone, he said into the camera, his voice steady. If you've seen Clara Whitmore, please call. He looked composed on television. Controlled. The kind of husband people believed in. The first Christmas without Clara arrived faster than anyone expected. Margaret insisted on decorating the tree. Thomas strung the same white lights along the porch. Daniel hung Clara's glass angel ornament in its usual spot. At dinner, Margaret placed an extra plate at the table again. Thomas cleared his throat gently. Maggie. She might walk through that door, Margaret said, not angrily, not desperately, simply as a statement of possibility. I won't have her think we stopped saving her a seat. The years did not pass in dramatic shifts. They passed in inches. In 1994, Sheriff Cole quietly adjusted the case status. It remained open, but the active search slowed. There was no evidence of foul play. No ransom demand. No body. The absence of proof created a strange kind of limbo, neither tragedy nor relief, just suspension. Rumors surfaced the way they do in small towns. Some whispered that Clara had run off with someone. Others suggested financial trouble, marital strain, secrets that no one had seen. Daniel heard the whispers. He never addressed them directly. He simply continued searching. I know my wife, he told anyone who asked. She didn't choose this. Margaret heard different whispers, gentler ones. Neighbors who stopped by with casseroles and said, maybe she just needed space. As if space could stretch across years. In 1995, Thomas's health began to falter. Nothing catastrophic. Just a slowing. A stiffness in his movements. He never complained. But sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he stood in Clara's doorway longer than necessary, his hand resting against the frame. One evening, Daniel found Margaret sitting on the edge of Clara's bed, holding a sweater to her face. I keep thinking, Margaret said softly, if she was cold that night. Daniel knelt beside her. She's strong, he replied. She always has been. The words were meant as comfort, but they carried a quiet question neither of them voiced aloud. By 1996, the flyers had faded in storefront windows. New businesses opened. Old ones closed. Clara's disappearance became something people spoke about in past tense. Remember that girl who went missing? Strangers would say. She had a name. She had parents. She had a life that had once been measured in ordinary days. Daniel began to change, though few could pinpoint when it started. He attended fewer volunteer meetings. He spoke less frequently about new leads. When Sheriff Cole called with updates, or lack of them, Daniel listened without interrupting. "You think she left?" Cole asked one afternoon, not unkindly. Daniel stared out his office window. "If she did," he said carefully, "she must have had a reason." It was the first time he had allowed that possibility to form aloud. By 1997, Maple Hollow had learned how to hold Clara's absence without discussing it. The town adjusted around the empty space she left behind, the way water flows around a stone. Inside the Whitmore home, however, nothing adjusted fully. Margaret still set an extra plate every Christmas Eve. Thomas still drove occasionally down County Road 14, slowing near the place where Clara's car had once sat alone. Daniel still kept her photograph in his wallet, though the edges had begun to soften with time. Some nights, Margaret lay awake listening for a car in the driveway. Other nights, she whispered a simple prayer into the dark. Let her be safe. Not, bring her home. Not anymore. Just safe. 10 years is a long time to live inside uncertainty. It reshapes people. It erodes certainty and sharpens quiet endurance. The Whitmores did not collapse under the weight of Clara's disappearance. They continued, cooking meals, paying bills, attending church. But every ordinary act carried an invisible thread connecting back to December 24, 1992. The night she said, "I'll be back before dessert." And never was. For 10 years, that night lived only in one other place. Long after Maple Hollow had folded Clara Whitmore's name into its quiet history, long after the flyers had been taken down and the search parties had stopped walking the tree lines, one memory remained sealed behind the steady composure of Dr. Evelyn Harper. On the night of December 24, 1992, just after 9 o'clock, Dr. Harper had been preparing to close her small private clinic on Birch Street. The overhead lights were dimmed. A ceramic nativity scene sat near the reception desk, its painted figures arranged carefully beneath a small wooden star. Outside, snow drifted against the windows, softening the world into silence. She was reaching for her coat when she heard a knock. It was not urgent. Not frantic. Just 3 measured taps against the glass door. When she turned, she saw Clara standing beneath the porch light. Dr. Harper had delivered Clara into the world 23 years earlier. She recognized her instantly, the dark hair, the gentle posture, the way she held her shoulders slightly forward as if bracing against something unseen. Clara stepped inside without removing her coat. Snow clung to the hem. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but thinner than usual. "I know you're closed." Dr. Harper studied her face carefully. There were no visible injuries. No bruises. But her eyes carried something deeper than panic, something quieter and more resolved. "Sit down, Clara," Dr. Harper said gently. "Tell me what's wrong." Clara did not sit at first. She stood near the examination table, fingers trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. "I can't stay here," she said. Dr. Harper waited. Years of practice had taught her that silence often invites truth more effectively than questions. "If I go back home tonight," Clara continued, "everything will look the same. The tree. The table. My mother's candles. And I'll still feel like I'm disappearing." Dr. Harper's voice remained calm. "Disappearing how?" Clara swallowed. "You can live in a place and still not exist." There was no accusation in her tone. No hysteria. Only exhaustion. She explained then, in pieces. Not of violence. Not of crime. But of control so subtle it left no marks. Of finances handled without her consent. Of conversations rewritten until she doubted her own memory. Of decisions made for her and presented as kindness. Of being told, gently and repeatedly, that she was too sensitive, too emotional, misunderstanding things. "He doesn't yell," Clara said. "He doesn't have to. He just makes me feel small." Dr. Harper listened without interruption. I found something, Clara added quietly. Papers. Accounts in my name I didn't know about. Loans I never agreed to. When I asked about it, I was told I'd forgotten the conversations. That I always forget. She shook her head, almost apologetically. Maybe I did forget. I don't know anymore. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Have you spoken to anyone else? Dr. Harper asked. Clara's lips curved faintly. Who would believe me? He's respected. So am I. We look fine. The words lingered between them. Dr. Harper chose her next sentence carefully. Are you in danger tonight? Clara hesitated. Not like that. But you're afraid. Yes. The fear was not immediate. It was cumulative. A slow erosion of certainty that had brought her to this small clinic instead of home. I can't file a report, Clara said. There's nothing to report. I just need to leave. Tonight. Before I lose my nerve. Dr. Harper felt the weight of what was being asked. Not medical treatment. Not advice. Action. If you walk away, she said softly, you leave everything behind. Clara nodded. Tears finally surfaced but did not fall. If I stay, she replied, I lose myself. The clinic clock ticked steadily on the wall. It was 9:18 p.m. Dr. Harper stepped toward her desk and opened a drawer. She removed an envelope containing emergency cash, funds she kept for patients in crisis. She wrote down the name of a former colleague in Oregon, a woman who ran a community health outreach program and occasionally helped people start over quietly. There's a bus leaving from Harrisburg just after midnight, Dr. Harper said. If you drive now, you'll make it. Clara's breath trembled for the first time. You'd help me? I delivered you into this world, Dr. Harper replied. My responsibility didn't end that day. Clara finally sat down. For a brief moment, she looked 23 and terrified all at once. Will you tell them? She asked. Dr. Harper held her gaze. Not unless you want me to. Clara nodded slowly. Then please don't. At 9:42 p.m., Clara left the clinic. Snow continued falling, erasing the path of her footsteps as quickly as she made them. She drove first toward County Road 14, not because she was lost, but because she needed a place to stop and breathe. She parked the car carefully along the shoulder. Locked it. Left her purse behind. She removed her wedding ring and held it in her palm for a long time before sliding it back on. Then she stepped away from the vehicle and walked toward the darker stretch of road where a passing car, arranged quietly by Dr. Harper, would pick her up. There were no screams. No struggle. No dramatic final glance. Only a woman choosing absence over erasure. 10 years passed before anyone else would know that Clara Whitmore did not vanish into the snow. She walked away from it. For 10 years, Dr. Evelyn Harper carried Christmas Eve inside her like a sealed envelope she did not dare open. She had practiced medicine in Maple Hollow for more than 4 decades. She had delivered babies who were now adults, set broken bones, sat beside hospital beds through long nights of uncertainty. She believed in discretion. In privacy. In the sacred trust between a physician and the person sitting across from her. But trust, she had come to learn, can grow heavy when it is bound to silence. On the night Clara Whitmore knocked on her clinic door, Evelyn had already turned off the lights and locked the front entrance. Snow pressed softly against the windows. She was reaching for her coat when she heard the knock, urgent, but not loud. Not frantic. Just determined. When she opened the door and saw Clara standing there, pale and trembling, something in Evelyn's chest tightened. Clara? It's Christmas Eve. I know, Clara said. I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go. Evelyn ushered her inside without another question. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine from the small wreath she had hung near the desk. Clara did not sit at first. She paced once across the room, then stopped, pressing her palms flat against the examination table as though steadying herself. "Are you hurt?" Evelyn asked gently. Clara shook her head. "Not like that." Those 3 words lingered in the air. Evelyn had seen enough marriages to recognize the difference between visible harm and something more subtle. Clara's eyes were not bruised. Her arms were not marked. But there was a shrinking in her posture, a hesitation in her breathing that spoke of erosion rather than impact. "He doesn't shout," Clara said after a long silence. "He doesn't raise his hand. He just rearranges things. Conversations. Decisions. Memories." Her voice wavered. "I feel like I'm disappearing in my own house." Evelyn listened without interrupting. Clara explained the financial accounts she hadn't known existed, the documents she had discovered that bore her signature but not her consent, the slow tightening of control masked as protection. Daniel Whitmore was admired in Maple Hollow. Polite. Responsible. Charitable. Clara knew what people would say if she accused him of anything intangible. "You're young," they would tell her. "Marriage takes compromise." But this did not feel like compromise. It felt like erasure. "If I stay," Clara whispered, "I'll stop recognizing myself." Evelyn asked the question she knew she had to ask. "Do you want me to call the sheriff?" Clara's answer came immediately. No. There had been no crime anyone could point to, no visible bruise to photograph. Only the slow narrowing of a life. "I just need to leave," Clara said. "Tonight." Evelyn understood the weight of that word. Leave meant no explanations. No confrontation. No gradual separation. It meant stepping into the snow and not looking back. She hesitated only once. "Your parents," she said softly. "They'll be frightened." Clara's face crumpled for the first time. "I know." Evelyn offered her tea. She gave her time to breathe. And then, with a steadiness she had cultivated over decades of difficult decisions, she made arrangements. A colleague in Harrisburg owed her a favor. A late-night bus would depart before dawn. Clara could reach a larger city before anyone realized she was truly gone. "Once you do this," Evelyn told her, "you cannot control the story that follows." Clara nodded. "I haven't controlled my own story in a long time." By the time Clara stepped back into the snow, she carried little with her. A small bag. A folded envelope of cash Evelyn insisted on pressing into her hand. No dramatic farewell. No tears that could be heard across a room. "Are you sure?" Evelyn asked one final time. Clara met her eyes. "I need to feel like I exist." Evelyn watched her walk toward the waiting car that would take her to the bus station. Snow fell steadily, softening each step almost as soon as it was made. For years afterward, that image returned to her at night. The search that followed had unfolded exactly as she feared. Sheriff Cole knocking on doors. Margaret Whitmore's voice cracking over the phone. Daniel's face on television, pleading for information. Evelyn had sat in her living room, hands folded tightly in her lap, saying nothing. Confidentiality was not just a professional guideline, it was a principle she had lived by. Clara had been an adult. She had made a decision of her own will. There had been no immediate threat to life. Evelyn told herself this repeatedly. Still, each time Margaret passed her on Main Street and offered a thin, hopeful smile, something inside Evelyn shifted. Silence, she began to realize, does not stay neutral. It changes shape over time. At first, it feels protective. Then it begins to feel like distance. Eventually, it can feel like harm. Evelyn retired in 1999. She told her colleagues it was time. She had earned rest. But the quiet that followed was not restful. Without the rhythm of patience and appointments, her thoughts lingered longer than she wished. On Christmas Eve each year, she stayed home. She did not attend midnight service. She did not join neighbors for dinner. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the snow fall, remembering Clara's final words inside that clinic. I need to feel like I exist. 10 years is a long time to hold a promise. It is longer still to watch a family grieve while knowing the grief is rooted in absence, not death. When Thomas Whitmore's heart finally failed in the winter of 2001, Evelyn attended the funeral. Margaret stood smaller than she once had, thinner, but composed. Daniel stood beside her, solemn and dignified. As the service ended, Margaret clasped Evelyn's hands. "If you ever hear anything," she said softly, "anything at all, please." The request was simple. Not accusatory. Just weary. That night, Evelyn did not sleep. For the first time, she allowed herself to question whether protecting Clara's choice had come at too high a cost. Confidentiality had preserved one woman's autonomy. But it had also prolonged a mother's waiting, a father's uncertainty, a husband's unanswered questions. Silence had once felt like loyalty. Now it felt like weight. And weight, she was beginning to understand, demands to be set down. The winter of 2002 arrived without ceremony. Maple Hollow no longer reacted when snow began to fall in late December. The town had learned to move forward through its seasons without pausing for ghosts. But inside the Whitmore house, time still carried a quiet fracture line that traced back to Christmas Eve 10 years earlier. Thomas Whitmore did not live to see the 10th anniversary of his daughter's disappearance. His heart gave out in early November, sudden and mercifully quick. The doctor called it natural causes. Those who knew him understood it had been something slower, 10 years of unanswered questions wearing down a steady man. At the funeral, Margaret stood straight despite the cold wind cutting through the cemetery. Daniel stood beside her, composed, his hand resting gently at her back. Dr. Evelyn Harper stood a few rows behind them, her black coat buttoned tight at the throat. As the casket lowered into the ground, Margaret whispered something no one else could hear. "Tell her we waited." The words found Evelyn like a physical blow. That night, she sat alone at her kitchen table long after dark. The house felt too large now that retirement had removed the daily noise of patients and phone calls. She stared at the clock on the wall, listening to its steady ticking. 10 years. She had held Clara's confidence through grief, through television appeals, through candlelight vigils and Christmas dinners with an empty chair. She had convinced herself that honoring an adult woman's choice was the most ethical path. Clara had not been coerced. She had not been injured. She had left with intention. But intention does not erase consequence. Evelyn opened a small wooden box she kept in the top drawer of her desk. Inside were folded notes, old patient cards, a faded photograph of her medical school class. Beneath them lay the slip of paper where she had once written the name of her colleague in Oregon, the woman who had helped Clara begin again. Evelyn held the paper in her hands. It had yellowed slightly at the edges. She had told herself that if Clara ever wanted to reach out to her family, she would. That if Clara needed intervention, she would ask. That the responsibility to break the silence did not belong to her. But Thomas Whitmore was gone now. And Margaret was shrinking under the weight of waiting. The next morning, Evelyn dressed carefully, the way she had for decades when walking into her clinic. She chose a navy wool coat and fastened the buttons slowly, her hands steady but deliberate. Sheriff Raymond Cole had aged in the past 10 years. His hair had thinned, and lines had settled around his eyes, but his posture remained straight behind the desk in his small office. When Evelyn stepped inside, he looked up with mild surprise. "Dr. Harper," he said. "Everything all right?" She closed the door behind her before answering. "No," she replied quietly. "It isn't." Cole leaned back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" Evelyn did not sit at first. She placed her gloves carefully on the edge of the desk and folded her hands. "I need to talk to you about Clara Whitmore." The room seemed to grow smaller. Cole's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "After all this time?" "Yes." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Go on." Evelyn lowered herself into the seat, drawing a slow breath. "She came to my clinic the night she disappeared." The words landed softly but carried enormous weight. Cole stared at her, unblinking. "You're sure?" "I am." Alive? Yes. A long silence followed. Cole's voice, when it returned, was steady but tighter than before. Why didn't you come forward? Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. Because she was an adult. Because she wasn't injured. Because she asked me not to. Cole stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet street. You knew the town was searching. Yes. You knew her family was tearing themselves apart. Evelyn's voice did not rise. I did. And you said nothing. I believed I was protecting her. Cole turned back toward her. And now? Evelyn's shoulders softened slightly. Now I believe my silence has lasted too long. Cole sat down slowly. Is she in danger? No. Was she? Not in the way people imagine. He studied her carefully. Where is she? Evelyn hesitated only once. Oregon. That's where she was headed. I can give you the name of the contact who helped her. Cole exhaled slowly. 10 years of unanswered questions had not prepared him for this kind of resolution, one without crime, without violence, without villain. She chose to leave, he said quietly. Yes. And she's been alive this whole time. Yes. Cole rubbed a hand over his face. Margaret deserves to know. I agree. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Evelyn stood. I am not asking you to absolve me, Raymond. I am only asking you to do what should have been done sooner. Cole nodded slowly. We'll proceed carefully. As Evelyn stepped back into the cold morning air, the town looked unchanged, storefronts open, traffic moving slowly along Main Street, the diner sign blinking as it always had. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 10 years, Clara Whitmore was no longer missing in the legal sense. She was simply absent. And absence, unlike mystery, can be bridged. For 10 years, Maple Hollow had built its own versions of that night. Some imagined a stranger on a dark road. Others imagined a hidden affair, a secret meeting gone wrong. A few believed Clara Whitmore had simply grown restless and chosen a different life. The absence of evidence had invited speculation, and speculation had slowly hardened into quiet myths. Now, seated across from Sheriff Raymond Cole in the modest conference room of the county building, Dr. Evelyn Harper began to dismantle those myths piece by piece. There was no struggle, she said calmly. No abduction. No accident. Cole's pen rested motionless above his notepad. She came to you on her own, he said. Yes. And she planned to leave. She didn't have a suitcase, Evelyn replied. But she had already made the decision. Cole leaned back in his chair, absorbing the weight of what that meant. Why? Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. Because she believed she was losing herself. That explanation, though simple, demanded more. Clara had not used the language of crisis that night. She had not accused Daniel Whitmore of violence or threatened exposure. Instead, she had described something far more difficult to articulate, a slow unraveling of certainty. She found financial documents she didn't recognize, Evelyn continued. Accounts opened in her name. Loans signed with what appeared to be her signature. Cole frowned. Forgery? Possibly, Evelyn said carefully. But when she confronted him, he told her she had agreed to it. That she had forgotten. That she was overreacting. Cole exhaled slowly. Gaslighting. Evelyn did not use the word, but she nodded. She began to doubt her own memory, Evelyn said. That was what frightened her most. Not what he did, but how easily he convinced her it hadn't happened. Cole had known Daniel for years. He had attended community fundraisers. He had shaken his hand after church services. Daniel was composed, articulate, reliable. You're telling me there was no physical abuse, Cole clarified. None that she described, Evelyn replied. But control doesn't always leave bruises. Clara had explained it in fragments that night, how Daniel insisted on managing all household finances, how he redirected conversations when she questioned him, how he corrected her version of events in front of friends until she began to question herself. He would smile, Clara had said. And say I get confused sometimes. That I imagine things. Over time, the pattern had grown. When she asked about the unfamiliar accounts, he had told her they discussed it months earlier. When she insisted they hadn't, he suggested she see a specialist for stress. When she withdrew in frustration, he reassured her in public, praised her generosity, described her as emotional but kind. It was subtle. Measured. Effective. She said she felt smaller each month, Evelyn told Cole. Like her world was narrowing, not through force, but through quiet redirection. Cole scribbled notes, then paused. Why not divorce? Evelyn answered without hesitation. In a town this small? With no visible wrongdoing? With a husband respected by everyone? She believed she would lose credibility before she gained freedom. Cole nodded grimly. Reputation in Maple Hollow carried weight. Daniel's public persona had been steady for years. She was afraid, Evelyn continued, that if she stayed, she would begin to believe she was the problem. The sheriff absorbed that carefully. And so she left without telling anyone. She didn't trust herself to withstand persuasion, Evelyn replied. If she had tried to explain, she feared she would be convinced to stay. That was the part Clara had spoken with the greatest clarity. If I talk to him, she had said that night, he'll make it sound reasonable again. There had been no shouting. No threats. Only the quiet fear of erasure. Cole set his pen down. Did she say she loved him? Evelyn considered the memory. She said she once did. The distinction lingered. Daniel had always insisted Clara wouldn't leave voluntarily. In one sense, he had been correct. She had not left impulsively. She had left deliberately, not because she stopped loving him overnight, but because she no longer recognized herself beside him. Did he know? Cole asked. Not that night, Evelyn said. She left before confrontation. Cole stood and walked toward the window again, the way he had when Evelyn first revealed Clara was alive. This isn't a crime, he said quietly. No, Evelyn agreed. It's something harder to prosecute. Cole turned back. Do you believe Daniel intended harm? Evelyn answered carefully. I believe he believed he was right. That was the truth Clara had struggled to articulate. Daniel did not see himself as controlling. He saw himself as managing, guiding, correcting inefficiencies. His version of events always centered on logic. Clara's reactions, in contrast, were framed as emotional distortions. Over time, Clara had begun to internalize that framing. She said she stopped arguing, Evelyn recalled. It felt easier. Cole returned to his seat. Where did she go after Oregon? She began working at a small public library outside Portland, Evelyn said. Under the name Claire Dawson. Cole nodded slowly. She rebuilt her life. Yes. Did she ever contact you? Once, Evelyn said. A postcard. No return address. It said, I'm okay. Cole exhaled. And she never contacted her family. Evelyn's expression softened. She didn't believe she deserved to. The room fell silent again. For 10 years, Daniel Whitmore had lived as a grieving husband. He had participated in searches. He had spoken to reporters. He had endured whispers. He had maintained composure. Now, the narrative shifted. She left him, Cole said quietly. Yes. And she never looked back. Not publicly. Cole closed the file in front of him. I'll need to confirm her location, he said. If she's alive and safe, we'll proceed carefully. Evelyn nodded. She may not want to return, Cole added. That's her choice, Evelyn replied. He studied her for a long moment. Do you regret helping her? Evelyn did not answer immediately. I regret the pain that followed, she said finally. But I do not regret believing her. That was the heart of it. Belief. Clara had come to the clinic not because she lacked options, but because she needed someone to believe her perception of her own life. To validate that feeling erased is not the same as being safe. Cole rose and extended his hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Evelyn stood as well. "I should have done it sooner." As she stepped outside, the sky over Maple Hollow was clear for the first time in days. The snow along Main Street had begun to melt at the edges, revealing the pavement beneath. 10 years earlier, the town had assumed something terrible had happened on a dark road. Now they would have to confront a quieter truth. Nothing had happened to Clara Whitmore. She had happened to herself. And sometimes, that is the most difficult truth of all. Before Sheriff Cole ever reopened the file, before Dr. Evelyn Harper walked into his office with a decade of silence in her hands, there had been a moment on County Road 14 when Clara Whitmore stood alone beside her parked car and understood that the rest of her life would divide itself into two parts, before this step, and after it. The truth about that night was not dramatic. There were no flashing lights, no raised voices, no slammed doors. There was only a woman sitting in the driver's seat of her own car, engine idling, staring at the reflection of her face in the dark windshield. Snow drifted steadily downward, quiet and persistent. The radio had been turned off. The world felt suspended. Clara rested her hands on the steering wheel and tried to steady her breathing. Her mother's dining table flashed in her mind, the extra napkin folded carefully beside her plate, the soft glow of candlelight. Her father's quiet presence by the window. Daniel's measured voice telling them she would be back soon. "I'll be back before dessert." The promise echoed against the inside of her ribs. She looked down at her left hand. The wedding band caught the faint light from a passing car and glinted once before fading again. For a long moment, she considered removing it. Her fingers slipped around the ring, twisting gently. If she took it off, it would feel final. If she left it on, it would feel dishonest. She did neither. She simply let her hand fall back into her lap. The documents she had found 2 days earlier replayed in her mind, the unfamiliar account numbers, the signatures that looked like hers but felt foreign. The way Daniel had smiled when she confronted him. "You worry too much," he had said softly. "We talked about this." "We didn't," she had replied. He had tilted his head slightly, as if disappointed. "Clara, we absolutely did. You forget things when you're stressed." The conversation had ended there. Not with anger, but with dismissal. It wasn't the first time. Over the past year, Clara had noticed how easily her questions were redirected. When she asked about money, she was reminded of bills he had paid. When she expressed doubt, she was told she was overthinking. When she insisted on clarity, she was met with reassurance that sounded kind but felt corrective. In public, Daniel praised her constantly. "Clara keeps me grounded," he would say. "She's the heart of our home." In private, her concerns dissolved into gentle lectures about practicality. There had been no violence. No shouting that would alarm neighbors. Only the slow erosion of confidence. Sitting in the car that night, Clara understood something with painful clarity: she no longer trusted her own memory. That realization frightened her more than any confrontation could have. She stepped out of the vehicle, the cold air cutting sharply across her face. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked a few steps away from the car and turned back toward it. It looked ordinary. Parked neatly along the shoulder. Headlights off. A normal car on a normal road. She locked the doors carefully and slipped the keys into her coat pocket. Her purse remained on the passenger side floor, an intentional choice. If she carried it, someone might assume she planned this. If she left it, perhaps they would think something else had happened. Even in leaving, she was thinking about how the story would look. The arranged ride would arrive within minutes. Dr. Harper had made the call discreetly. Clara had memorized the details: Harrisburg bus station, midnight departure, a new name to use until she felt steady again. She closed her eyes briefly. Her mother's voice rose in her memory. "Don't stay long." Her father's steady nod. Daniel's calm assurance. For a flicker of a second, doubt surged. What if she was misreading everything? What if she was simply tired? What if leaving would prove Daniel right, that she was impulsive, emotional, incapable of working through discomfort? The questions tightened around her like the cold. But then she remembered the moment she stood in her own kitchen holding financial papers she didn't recognize, hearing Daniel gently explain that she had signed them weeks ago. And she had believed him. That was what terrified her most. If she stayed, she would eventually surrender her own version of reality. The headlights of a sedan appeared in the distance, cutting through the snowfall. This is it, she thought. The car slowed beside her. The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind but efficient eyes, leaned across to unlock the passenger door. "Clara?" she asked quietly. "Yes." Evelyn called. Clara nodded and slipped inside. As the car pulled away from County Road 14, she did not look back at her own vehicle. She kept her gaze forward, watching the snow blur against the windshield. "You're sure about this?" the driver asked gently. Clara swallowed. "I have to be." The ride to Harrisburg passed in silence. The town lights of Maple Hollow faded behind them, swallowed by darkness and falling snow. Clara felt neither relief nor panic, only a strange, hollow steadiness. At the bus station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A handful of travelers sat scattered along metal benches, their bags resting at their feet. No one paid her any attention. She purchased a ticket under the name Claire Dawson. When the bus finally arrived, its doors folding open with a mechanical sigh, she hesitated only once, one final breath suspended between departure and return. The driver glanced at her. "You getting on?" Clara nodded and stepped forward. As she climbed the narrow steps, she felt something unexpected, not freedom, not triumph, but clarity. She was not running from danger in the way people might later imagine. She was running toward her own sense of self. The bus doors closed behind her with a firm click. The engine rumbled to life. Outside, snow continued to fall across Pennsylvania, covering the quiet road where her car waited alone. By the time the bus crossed state lines, Clara Whitmore no longer existed in the world she had left behind. In her place sat Claire Dawson, staring out at the dark horizon, carrying grief, guilt, and something new beneath it all, the fragile beginning of autonomy. 10 years later, that choice would echo back through Maple Hollow. But on that night, it was simply a woman stepping onto a bus, believing that existence was worth the cost of absence. The bus carried Clara through the night and into a landscape she had never seen before. By dawn, the sky above the highway had softened from black to pale gray. Snow gave way to rain somewhere past the state line, and the world outside the window looked unfamiliar but not unwelcoming. Clara did not sleep. She sat upright with her small bag tucked beneath her seat, hands folded in her lap, watching mile markers pass as if each one were proof that she was still moving. When the bus pulled into Harrisburg and later continued westward, she studied the other passengers quietly. A college student with headphones. A mother soothing a restless toddler. A middle-aged man flipping through a newspaper. No one looked at her twice. No one recognized her. For the first time in years, she felt anonymous. By the time she reached Oregon 2 days later, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. The air was damp, tinged with the scent of pine and distant rain. The woman Dr. Harper had contacted met her outside the station. Her name was Marlene Tate, practical and brisk, with a kindness that did not ask questions it did not need answered. "You're Claire?" Marlene asked. Clara hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Yes." The name felt foreign in her mouth. Claire Dawson. It sounded lighter somehow, less tethered to expectation. Marlene drove her to a small apartment above a bakery on a quiet street lined with maples. The space was modest, a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a kitchenette with pale yellow cabinets, but it was clean and warm. "You can stay here until you find your footing," Marlene said. "No one will bother you." Clara stood alone in the center of the room after Marlene left. She placed her bag on the bed and slowly turned in a circle, absorbing the silence. No framed photographs on the walls. No familiar voices in the next room. No one to correct her recollection of a conversation or adjust her understanding of a moment. The quiet was startling. The first weeks were the hardest. She woke instinctively before dawn, heart racing, certain she had forgotten something important. She expected Daniel's calm voice drifting from another room, expected her mother's gentle knock on the door during holidays, expected the weight of explanation pressing against her chest. Instead, there was only the hum of the bakery ovens downstairs and the distant sound of delivery trucks rolling past. Marlene helped her secure a temporary position at a community library that needed extra hands organizing archives. The work was simple but steady, sorting donated books, cataloging old periodicals, shelving returns. Clara found comfort in the structure. Books did not argue with her. They did not reinterpret her memories. They sat where she placed them. On her first day, the library director, a gray-haired man named Samuel Green, shook her hand warmly. "Welcome aboard, Claire," he said. "We're grateful for the help." Claire. Each time someone used the name, she felt both shielded and hollowed. It allowed her space. It also reminded her that she was hiding. She rented a small post office box instead of listing her apartment address anywhere official. She paid for groceries in cash whenever possible. She avoided television news and did not read newspapers from Pennsylvania. Freedom came in small increments. The first time she opened a bank account in her own name, her chosen name, she felt her pulse quicken. She filled out the paperwork carefully, reviewing each line before signing. No one reached across the desk to correct her penmanship or clarify her misunderstanding. The account was modest, but it was hers. She learned the bus routes across town. She memorized the scent of rain on pavement. She bought a single houseplant and placed it near the window, watching its leaves tilt toward the light. Months passed. With distance, the sharp edges of fear softened, but guilt took their place. On Christmas Eve 1993, exactly 1 year after she left Maple Hollow, Claire sat alone in her apartment. Snow did not fall in Oregon that night. Instead, rain tapped gently against the glass. She brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window, imagining her mother setting an extra plate at the table. "I'm okay," she whispered into the empty room. She did not pick up the phone. She told herself that contacting them would unravel everything, that Daniel would convince her to return, that her parents would plead, that the fragile independence she was building would collapse under the weight of obligation. So she stayed silent. In 1994, she transitioned from temporary help to a permanent position at the library. Samuel praised her attention to detail. "You've got a steady mind," he told her once. "You don't rush." The compliment startled her. Steady. For years, she had been told she overthought things. That she worried too much. That her instincts were unreliable. Now, colleagues trusted her judgment without question. She made acquaintances but few close friends. When conversations drifted toward childhood memories or family holidays, she offered vague answers. "Back east," she would say with a small smile. The wedding band remained on her finger for nearly 2 years. Not because she intended to return, but because removing it felt like rewriting history too quickly. One quiet afternoon in 1995, she slipped it off and placed it inside a small tin box at the back of her dresser. The indentation it left on her skin faded slowly. By 1997, Claire Dawson felt less like an alias and more like a self she had grown into. She rented a slightly larger apartment. She adopted a rescue cat. She began taking evening writing classes at a local community center. Still, certain nights unsettled her. She would wake from dreams in which her father stood at the end of a long driveway, waiting without anger but with deep, unspoken confusion. Or she would imagine her mother glancing at the front door each time headlights passed. The cost of autonomy was absence. She told herself that her parents would eventually accept the unknown as finality. That perhaps they would build a life around the silence the way towns do around old landmarks. But part of her knew that hope does not fade easily in small places. In 1999, she mailed a postcard to Dr. Harper. No return address. Only 3 words written carefully across the back. "I'm still here." She did not ask about Maple Hollow. She did not ask about Daniel. She focused instead on the quiet life she had constructed, one built not on rebellion, but on reclamation. By the early 2000s, Claire had become indispensable at the library. She organized community reading nights, helped children find books that matched their interests, listened patiently to elderly patrons recount stories from decades past. "You're a good listener," Samuel told her once. The comment lingered. Listening had once meant absorbing correction. Now it meant offering space. And yet, even in this steadier life, there remained an invisible thread stretching across the country, tying her back to a house on Cedar Lane where a candle might still burn beside an empty plate. Claire Dawson had built a life. Clara Whitmore had left one behind. The two identities lived quietly within the same woman, separated not by distance alone, but by the decision she had made on a snow-covered road 10 years earlier, to exist, even if it meant disappearing. For nearly a decade, Clara Whitmore had existed only in two places, in the quiet routines of Maple Hollow's memory and in the steady, carefully rebuilt life of Claire Dawson in Oregon. When Sheriff Raymond Cole reopened the file, he did so without spectacle. There were no press conferences, no flashing lights. He simply pulled the worn folder from the archive cabinet and placed it on his desk. The edges were softened from years of handling. Clara's photograph, paper-clipped to the inside cover, still showed a young woman caught mid-smile, unaware that her life would divide itself in two. Cole began where all investigations begin, with confirmation. The name Evelyn Harper had provided led to a community outreach contact in Oregon. That contact led, quietly, to employment records at a small public library outside Portland. Claire Dawson. Hired in early 1993. No prior references listed beyond a brief note from a Pennsylvania medical office. Cole stared at the date. Just weeks after Clara disappeared. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the library. His voice was calm, professional. "I'm looking to confirm employment for Claire Dawson," he said. The director, Samuel Green, responded politely. "She's been with us a long time. Nearly 10 years. Is she available?" There was a brief pause. "May I ask what this is regarding?" Cole hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It concerns a missing person case from Pennsylvania." Silence stretched across the line. "I'll let her know someone from law enforcement would like to speak with her," Green replied cautiously. In Oregon, Claire was shelving returns when Samuel approached her. "There's a call for you," he said gently. "From Pennsylvania." The word struck like a dropped glass. Pennsylvania. She felt the blood drain from her face. "Did they say what it's about?" she asked, though she already knew. "A missing person case." For a moment, the room tilted. The shelves, the books, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, all of it felt distant. "I'll take it," she said. She walked into the small office near the back of the library and closed the door. The phone receiver felt heavier than it should have. "This is Claire," she said. There was a brief pause before a measured voice responded. "Miss Dawson, my name is Raymond Cole. I'm a sheriff from Maple Hollow, Pennsylvania." The air seemed to thin. "I believe you were once known as Clara Whitmore." Her fingers tightened around the receiver. For years she had rehearsed this moment in her mind, imagined the accusation, the anger, the shock. Instead, Cole's tone remained steady. Not accusing. Not triumphant. Simply factual. "Yes," she said quietly. "We have reason to believe you left voluntarily in December of 1992, he continued. "Is that correct?" "Yes." "You were not harmed?" "No." "You were not coerced?" "No." A long silence followed. "Your family believed you were dead," Cole said carefully. "They never stopped searching." The words landed heavier than any accusation could have. Claire closed her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "Your father passed away last year," Cole added. Her breath caught. "How?" she managed. "Heart failure." She leaned back against the desk, steadying herself. For years she had imagined her parents frozen in time, waiting, but unchanged. She had not allowed herself to imagine funerals. "I never meant to hurt them," she said. "I understand," Cole replied. "But they deserve to know you're alive." She did not argue. In Maple Hollow, Cole prepared Margaret Whitmore before confirming anything publicly. He drove to Cedar Lane on a gray afternoon, hat in hand, much as he had the night Clara vanished. Margaret opened the door slowly. She had grown thinner over the years, her hair now streaked with more silver than brown. "Sheriff," she said, her voice careful. "Did you find something?" Cole removed his hat. "Yes." They sat at the kitchen table where Clara had once promised to return before dessert. The wood bore faint scratches from decades of use. "Margaret," he began gently, "Clara is alive." For a moment, Margaret did not react. The words seemed too large to process. "She's alive," he repeated. Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her chest. "Where?" "Oregon." She chose to leave?" "Yes." The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Margaret's eyes filled, but she did not cry immediately. Instead, she nodded once, slowly. "I always prayed she was safe," she said. "I didn't know I'd have to pray she was brave enough to come back." Daniel received the news differently. When Cole informed him, he remained composed, his jaw tightening only slightly. "She left," Daniel said flatly. "Yes." "She never contacted anyone?" "No." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I see." But whether he truly did was another question. In Oregon, Claire sat alone in her apartment that evening. The call had ended with a simple request. "Would you be willing to speak with your mother?" She stared at the phone for a long time. 10 years earlier, she had believed leaving was the only way to preserve herself. Now, she faced a different decision. Not whether to survive, but whether to return. The investigation had reopened not to solve a crime, but to bridge an absence. And bridges, unlike disappearances, require both sides to step forward. The days after Sheriff Raymond Cole's call felt suspended, as though time itself was waiting for Clara Whitmore to decide who she was willing to be. In Oregon, Claire Dawson moved through her routines with a quiet, mechanical precision. She shelved books. She answered patrons' questions. She fed the cat and watered the plant near the window. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. Her father was gone. The news settled heavily in her chest. For 10 years, she had imagined him as steady and unmovable, standing near the front window on Cedar Lane, bourbon glass in hand, watching snowfall. She had not allowed herself to picture a graveside. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table and unfolded a piece of paper she had carried since 1992, the address of the Whitmore home written in her own handwriting. She traced the letters slowly. Her mother would answer the door differently now. Slower. Smaller. She picked up the phone. Sheriff Cole had offered to arrange the call, to mediate if needed. Clara declined. If she was going to step back into the life she had left, she would do it without a buffer. The line rang 3 times before Margaret Whitmore answered. "Hello?" The voice was thinner than Clara remembered, but unmistakable. Clara's throat tightened. For a moment, she could not speak. "Hello?" Margaret repeated. "It's me," Clara whispered. Silence. Then, a soft intake of breath, sharp, disbelieving. "Clara?" "Yes." The word trembled between them. Margaret did not ask where she had been. She did not demand explanation. She simply began to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, but in a way that sounded like something long held finally breaking. "I prayed," Margaret said through the tears. "Every night, I prayed." "I know," Clara replied, though she had not known, not truly, until that moment. They spoke for nearly an hour. Clara answered questions carefully. She confirmed she was safe. She acknowledged that she had left by choice. She did not yet speak Daniel's name. "Will you come home?" Margaret asked finally. Clara closed her eyes. The word home felt complicated. "Yes," she said. The flight from Portland to Pennsylvania was quieter than the bus ride 10 years earlier. Clara did not travel under an alias this time. She purchased the ticket as Clara Whitmore. The name felt heavier now, reclaimed but weighted with consequence. As the plane descended toward Harrisburg, she looked out at the patchwork of fields below. Autumn had softened the landscape into muted browns and golds. Maple Hollow lay somewhere beyond the tree line. Sheriff Cole met her at the airport, not in uniform but in a plain coat and hat. He approached slowly, giving her space to change her mind if she wished. "You look well," he said gently. She nodded. "Older. So do we all." The drive back to Maple Hollow was quiet. Familiar road signs appeared one by one, each triggering a flicker of memory. The grocery store. The old pharmacy. County Road 14. Clara's breath caught as they passed the stretch of highway where her car had once sat alone beneath falling snow. It looked ordinary in daylight, just a narrow shoulder bordered by trees. "You don't have to stop," Cole said. "I don't want to," she replied. When they turned onto Cedar Lane, Clara felt her pulse in her throat. The Whitmore house stood unchanged, porch lights framing the doorway, white paint slightly weathered but steady. Margaret stood on the front step. She did not rush forward. She did not call out. She simply waited. Clara stepped out of the car slowly. For a second, they only looked at each other. 10 years had altered them both. Margaret's hair was almost entirely gray now. Clara's face carried sharper lines at the corners of her eyes. They were older versions of the same bond. Then Margaret moved. She closed the distance between them in steady steps and wrapped her arms around her daughter without hesitation. The embrace was firm, not fragile. "You're here," Margaret whispered into her shoulder. "I'm here," Clara replied. No accusation followed. No immediate interrogation. Just contact, warm and undeniable. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and polished wood. The furniture remained in familiar places. The Christmas tree was not up, it was October, but the space beside the window where it usually stood felt charged with memory. Margaret guided Clara to the kitchen table. "I don't need details tonight," she said gently. "I just need to see you." Clara nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks for the first time since the phone call. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. Margaret reached across the table and covered her hands. "You didn't hurt me," she replied. "You left. That's different." The distinction mattered. Later that evening, Daniel arrived. He had been informed of Clara's return but had not been invited inside immediately. He stood at the threshold, posture composed, expression carefully neutral. Clara rose to meet him in the living room. They faced each other in a silence that felt heavier than any argument. "You're alive," Daniel said. "Yes." He studied her face as though searching for something familiar. "You could have told me." "I couldn't," she answered softly. "Why?" The question held no anger, only confusion. Clara drew a steady breath. "Because I stopped trusting myself." Daniel frowned slightly. "I never hurt you." "I know," she said. "Then why leave?" She met his eyes evenly. "Because I was disappearing." The words did not accuse. They simply stated. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his expression. "I thought I was helping you," he said quietly. "I believe you did," she replied. That was the hardest truth of all, that harm does not always come wrapped in cruelty. Daniel nodded once. "I won't stand in your way." There was no dramatic confrontation. No raised voices. Only recognition that something had broken long before the snow began to fall that night. After he left, Clara returned to the kitchen where Margaret waited. "You don't owe anyone a defense," Margaret said gently. Clara looked around the room, at the worn table, the familiar cabinets, the small clock ticking above the stove. "I owe you 10 years, she said. Margaret shook her head slowly. "You owed yourself safety. I just wish you'd trusted me enough to say so." Clara leaned forward and rested her forehead against her mother's shoulder, allowing herself to be held without explanation. Outside, Maple Hollow continued its quiet routines. Cars passed along Cedar Lane. Porch lights flickered on as evening deepened. There were no news cameras. No crowds gathered at the fence. Sheriff Cole had kept the details contained, allowing the reunion to belong to those it affected most. For the first time in a decade, the Whitmore house no longer held an empty chair in memory of a missing daughter. Clara Whitmore had returned. Not as the woman who left, but as the woman who survived her own disappearance. Daniel Whitmore did not sleep the night Clara returned. After leaving the house on Cedar Lane, he drove slowly through Maple Hollow, past storefronts that had not changed in a decade, past the church where they had once stood side by side exchanging vows, past County Road 14 where her car had been found under falling snow. The road looked smaller now. Ordinary. Deceptively harmless. He parked outside his own house and remained in the driver's seat long after the engine went silent. She said she was disappearing. The words replayed in his mind, not as accusation, but as revelation. For 10 years, Daniel had lived inside a different narrative. In his version, Clara had been taken. Or overwhelmed. Or confused. He had endured sympathy from neighbors, pitying glances at church, the quiet judgment of those who believed a husband must have missed something. He had believed he was the injured party. Now, the story shifted. Inside his house, the air felt too still. Clara's absence had once filled it with echoing silence. Tonight, her return filled it with something heavier, accountability. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. The overhead light hummed faintly. The chair across from him, once empty in grief, now felt empty in a different way, not lost, but chosen. He replayed the conversations from the months before she left. The financial accounts. The documents. Her questions. He had not considered himself dishonest. The investments had seemed logical to him, efficient ways to consolidate debt and build credit. He had signed her name to certain forms when she was busy or distracted, telling himself it was practical. When she confronted him, he had dismissed her concerns, not out of malice, but out of certainty. "I already explained that," he had said more than once. Had he? Or had he simply decided explanation was unnecessary? He remembered the look on her face the night she asked about the unfamiliar loan. Not anger. Not hysteria. Something quieter. Hurt. "You don't remember?" he had asked gently, as though speaking to a child. At the time, he had believed he was calming her. Now he saw something else. He had corrected her version of events in public, too, subtle adjustments disguised as humor. "Clara gets the details mixed up," he would say with a soft smile when she contradicted him at dinner parties. "That's why she keeps me around." Laughter would follow. Clara would smile faintly and fall silent. He had told himself it was harmless. He had never shouted. Never struck her. Never raised a hand in anger. He had provided stability, paid bills, volunteered at fundraisers. He had been, by every visible measure, a good husband. But goodness, he realized, is not measured only by what you avoid doing. It is measured by what you allow someone else to remain. Clara had said she stopped trusting herself. That was the fracture he had not seen. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. There had been a moment, he could see it clearly now, when she stood in the kitchen holding those papers, her brow furrowed, her voice steady but uncertain. "I don't remember signing this." Instead of sitting down beside her, instead of pulling out a chair and saying, "Let's go through it together," he had waved a hand dismissively. "You worry too much." He had meant reassurance. She had heard erasure. In the years after she disappeared, Daniel had endured questions from reporters and neighbors. "Did you argue that night?" "No." Was she unhappy? Not that I knew. Both statements had been technically true. He had not known. Because he had not listened. The realization did not come as a dramatic collapse. It arrived slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you understood. He had loved Clara. He believed that still. But love, unexamined, can become possession without intention. He had structured their life efficiently, finances centralized, decisions streamlined, social obligations managed. He believed he was protecting them from uncertainty. In doing so, he had left little room for her autonomy. He rose from the table and walked to the bedroom closet. On the top shelf sat a small wooden box containing her belongings he had never moved, an old scarf, a pair of earrings, a photograph from their honeymoon. He opened the box and studied the photograph. Clara's smile in that picture was wide, unguarded. He searched for signs of the woman who would later stand on County Road 14 and decide to leave. There were none. Because she had not left in a single moment. She had left in inches. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. I thought I was helping you. The words echoed softly against the walls. He believed them when he said them to her. He believed them now. But belief does not erase impact. The next morning, he walked to the Whitmore house again. Margaret answered the door. She's resting, Margaret said calmly. I don't need to see her, Daniel replied. I just need you to know. I never meant to hurt her. Margaret regarded him for a long moment. I don't think you did, she said gently. But intention isn't the same as effect. He nodded, absorbing the distinction. I won't contest anything, he added. Whatever she wants. Margaret's gaze softened. That's a start. As Daniel walked back down Cedar Lane, the town looked unchanged. Children waited at a bus stop. The diner sign blinked steadily. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm. For 10 years, he had believed himself abandoned. Now he understood something more difficult. He had not been left because he was cruel. He had been left because he had not known how to make space for another person's voice beside his own. And that realization, though quiet, was the first honest step he had taken in a very long time. By the time Daniel Whitmore closed his front door that evening, the realization had already begun settling into him, not as outrage, not as humiliation, but as something quieter and more unsettling. He had not lost Clara to violence. He had not been betrayed by some hidden affair. He had not been the victim of tragedy. He had been left. The difference carried weight. Word traveled through Maple Hollow the way it always had, not through headlines or broadcasts, but through lowered voices and kitchen conversations. Sheriff Cole had kept the details restrained, but the essential truth moved quickly: Clara Whitmore was alive. She had left voluntarily. She had returned. At the diner on Main Street, coffee cups paused midair. She walked away, someone asked. 10 years ago, another replied. At church that Sunday, pews filled with a different kind of attention. Not scandal, not exactly, something closer to collective disbelief. People who had prayed for Clara's safety now wrestled with a different question: how could someone leave without a word? Margaret Whitmore felt the shift immediately. Sympathy, once unconditional, had become complicated. Neighbors stopped by with cautious smiles. We're so glad she's safe, Mrs. Hargrove said, clasping Margaret's hands tightly. That's what matters. It was what mattered. But it was not all that mattered. Clara stepped back into public slowly. The first time she walked along Main Street, the familiar storefronts felt smaller than she remembered. The bakery, the pharmacy, the blinking diner sign, they had all continued without her. Eyes followed her, not unkindly, but curiously. She understood. For 10 years, she had been a story people told in fragments. Now she stood in front of them, breathing. Inside the grocery store, a woman near the produce section approached hesitantly. Clara, she asked softly. Yes. I just wanted to say, we prayed for you. Clara nodded. Thank you. The woman hesitated before adding, "We never imagined." Clara offered a small, steady smile. "I know." She did not offer explanations in aisles between apples and bread. She did not defend her choice in whispered corners. Her return was not a confession tour. It was a presence. Daniel, meanwhile, experienced the town's reaction differently. At first, the response was measured politeness. "Must have been hard," one man said quietly outside the hardware store. Daniel nodded. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The narrative he had lived inside for a decade, grieving husband, unwavering, dignified, had altered. People did not accuse him. They did not confront him. Yet subtle glances carried questions he had never considered before. Had he missed something? Had he misunderstood something? One afternoon, he sat alone at the diner counter, staring into a cup of black coffee. Sheriff Cole slid onto the stool beside him. "You holding up?" Cole asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I didn't see it." "See what?" "That she felt that way." Cole did not rush to fill the silence. Daniel traced the rim of his mug with one finger. "I thought I was being responsible. Careful. Organized." He shook his head slightly. "I thought that was enough." Cole leaned back. "Intent isn't always impact." Daniel nodded once, absorbing the words without protest. The town, too, began its own reckoning. For years, Clara's disappearance had been treated as mystery. Now it demanded introspection. At a small women's Bible study, the conversation turned unexpectedly serious. "She didn't accuse him of anything criminal," one woman said. "But she felt erased." Another nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's harder to name." Maple Hollow was not accustomed to conversations about emotional autonomy or subtle control. But Clara's return forced the issue gently into the open. Not through scandal, but through presence. Margaret, steadfast as ever, set boundaries without fanfare. "If you're curious," she told one neighbor kindly, "ask her yourself. She doesn't need me to speak for her." Clara appreciated that. In quiet moments at home, mother and daughter rebuilt their rhythm. They cooked together. They walked in the evenings. They spoke of Thomas, of his steady habits, his early mornings, the way he used to stand by the window when it snowed. "I wish he'd known," Clara said one evening. Margaret squeezed her hand. "He knew you were strong. That's what mattered to him." Daniel requested one final conversation before Clara decided her future. They met in the living room where Christmas lights once glowed against falling snow. Daylight streamed through the windows now, unfiltered. "I've thought about what you said," Daniel began. "So have I," Clara replied. He did not argue this time. He did not redirect. He listened. "I never meant to make you feel small," he said quietly. "I know," she answered. "I believed structure was safety. For you, maybe." The exchange held no bitterness, only clarity. "I'm not coming back," Clara said gently. Daniel nodded, his acceptance slower this time, but real. "I hope you find what you were looking for," he said. "I already did," she replied. As weeks passed, Maple Hollow adjusted once more. The story settled into a new shape. Clara was no longer the missing girl. She was the woman who left and returned. Some residents continued to question her choice privately. Others found themselves quietly admiring her courage. In small towns, narratives harden easily. But they can soften too. Clara's presence did not disrupt Maple Hollow in dramatic ways. It did something subtler. It expanded the town's understanding of what disappearance can mean. Not every absence is tragedy. Not every return is reconciliation. Sometimes, it is simply recognition that survival can look like leaving, and that coming back requires a different kind of strength. On Cedar Lane, porch lights continued to glow each evening. Snow would fall again someday. But when it did, it would no longer cover uncertainty. It would fall on a house where the missing had returned, and where silence had finally given way to truth. Winter returned to Maple Hollow the following year with a softer edge. Snow settled again along Cedar Lane, resting on porch railings and tree branches the way it had on the night Clara drove away 10 years earlier. But the meaning of it had changed. It no longer symbolized unanswered questions or frozen time. It was simply winter, ordinary, inevitable, passing. Clara stood by the front window one evening as the first flakes began to fall. Margaret moved quietly in the kitchen behind her, humming a hymn under her breath. The house no longer felt like a museum of waiting. It felt lived in again. "I used to imagine this night differently," Clara said softly. Margaret paused. "How so?" "I thought if I ever came back, everything would feel dramatic. Like something broken being forced back together." Margaret smiled gently. "Healing is rarely dramatic. It's slow." That was the truth of it. Clara's return had not erased the 10 missing years. It had not restored her father to the head of the table. It had not made Daniel's confusion vanish overnight. What it had done was simpler and more honest. It had ended the waiting. In the months after her return, Clara chose not to reclaim her old life exactly as it had been. She finalized the divorce quietly. There were no public accusations, no bitter disputes. Just paperwork signed with clarity rather than fear. Daniel moved through the process with restraint. He did not argue terms. He did not attempt persuasion. Something inside him had shifted permanently. His realization had not been explosive, but it had been real. "I thought I was protecting us," he told Sheriff Cole one afternoon. Cole nodded. "Sometimes protection feels like pressure." Daniel absorbed that quietly. Clara, meanwhile, faced a different kind of reckoning, one not rooted in conflict, but in guilt. She visited her father's grave alone one crisp morning. Frost clung to the grass around the headstone. She knelt and brushed a few fallen leaves aside with careful fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The apology was not for leaving. It was for the silence that followed. She could not change the years he had spent not knowing. But she could stand there now, fully present, and acknowledge both the love she carried and the autonomy she had chosen. When she returned home, Margaret did not ask what had been said. She simply placed a cup of coffee on the table and sat beside her daughter. "You don't owe the past a punishment," Margaret said gently. "You owe the future honesty." Clara carried that sentence with her. Maple Hollow adjusted, as small towns always do. The initial whispers softened into acceptance. People grew used to seeing Clara at the post office, at the grocery store, walking alongside her mother in the evenings. Some still struggled to understand. How could she leave without a word? A man at the barber shop asked one afternoon. An older woman in the waiting chair responded quietly, maybe because she didn't think she'd be heard. The conversation ended there. Clara did not become a spokesperson for anything. She did not tell her story publicly in dramatic speeches. But when a young woman from church approached her one day, eyes uncertain, voice low, Clara listened. "Is it possible," the woman asked carefully, "to leave something that doesn't look broken?" Clara met her gaze steadily. "Yes," she said. "It is." The answer did not condemn anyone. It simply acknowledged that safety and selfhood are not always visible from the outside. As Christmas Eve approached again, Margaret set the table with familiar care. This time, there was no extra plate. Not because hope had died, but because absence had ended. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway watching her mother arrange the silverware. "I never stopped loving you," Margaret said without turning around. "I never stopped loving you either," Clara replied. Love had not been the problem. Silence had been. Looking back, Clara understood that her disappearance had not been an act of rebellion or cruelty. It had been a response to a quieter erosion, the slow fading of her own voice inside a structure that looked stable from the outside. She had not left because she was unloved. She had left because she needed to hear herself clearly again. Daniel's realization, Margaret's endurance, Sheriff Cole's patience, all of it formed part of the larger truth. No one in Maple Hollow had been entirely villain or entirely victim. They had been people navigating assumptions about marriage, stability, and strength. Clara's return did not assign blame. It assigned clarity. One evening, as snow fell softly outside and candlelight flickered against the walls, Clara found herself standing once more near the Christmas tree. She reached for the glass angel ornament she had made as a child and held it carefully in her hands. 10 years earlier, she had promised to return before dessert. She had failed to keep that promise. But she had kept a different one, the promise to herself that she would not vanish inside her own life. Margaret stepped beside her, adjusting a strand of lights. "You look peaceful," her mother observed. Clara considered the word. "I am," she said. Peace, she realized, was not the absence of consequence. It was the presence of truth. The story of Clara Whitmore was never about crime. It was about quiet erosion, about the courage to step away from something that looked intact but felt hollow, and about the humility required to return and face the ripples of that choice. Some disappearances are forced by tragedy. Others are chosen in order to survive. And sometimes, the bravest act is not leaving. It is coming back, not to reclaim the past, but to live honestly in the present.